This is Mr. Wartsky, and welcome to the first screencast of Speciation, which is a continuation of the evolution notes. Let's get started. So we're going to define some terms, and you need to write down all these definitions. Hit pause if you need to. Speciation is the formation of a new species, and this is within the biological species concept. Species, this is the biological species concept definition. It's a population of organisms that can produce fertile offspring. The key is fertile offspring. If you have kids and they are not fertile, then you are of different species, like a horse and a donkey when they have a mule. So if somebody tries to sell you a male and a female mule so you can have mule babies, that is false because they are sterile. A population is a group of organisms that are of the same species that live in the same area. Race. Members of a population that differ somewhat genetically but are of the same species. Humans might be made up of different races, but we're all the same species. Dogs, the different breeds are different races, and they are still the same species. And a hybrid is an offspring of two different species, and those hybrids are usually sterile. Then we'll talk about later how one hybrid, usually the female, can reproduce with a parent, not the parents, but a parent species. So in speciation, there are two main types of speciation. There's allopatric and sympatric. Allopatric speciation occurs with geographical isolation, and sympatric speciation can happen within the population. Now, sympatric is usually only kept to insects or maybe flowers, but that's about it. We're going to focus our attention on allopatric speciation. In allopatric, you start off with a large population which is first split by some type of geographical barrier. We're talking about a river, oceans, forest, glaciers, valleys, mountains, lakes. If you're a fish, yeah, that's a big thing because the lakes aren't connected. So when that happens, you prevent gene flow, right? The movement of organisms between populations, the gene flow between populations. Over time, each population is exposed to a different environmental condition. Natural selection will push each population in a different direction. Hopefully you're getting all this down. If not, hit pause. And what we have here, for example, population of bugs split by maybe some type of river. We have over time natural selection due to some type of different environmental condition or different predator. And when they get back together, they cannot mate and have fertile offspring. They did this with fruit flies, Drosophila melanogaster. They put them in different boxes, had different environmental conditions, got back together. They could not form fertile offspring with the different populations. So over time, if the populations could get back together, they could not have fertile offspring. Now, since you cannot have fertile offspring, that is called reproductive isolation. First, you have geographic isolation, then reproductive isolation. Another example, true example, Darwin's finches. There are 13 different species on the Galapagos Islands. They believe they were from the same population species, which split when they went to the different islands looking for food. When they were on the different islands, they had different food supplies, and populations were pushed in different directions. Focus, when you take a look at the finches, focus on the types of beaks that they have. And here we have 13 different populations from the same population. And if you take a look at the beaks, they're all different because they eat different foods. They have all the different types of beaks down here. And all the different types of finches. So Darwin's finches shows speciation. This is divergent evolution. The two populations will have similar DNA, they'll have homologous structures, and probably live near each other. So we need to be able to tie speciation together with natural selection or evolution. Then we'll even talk about this more when we talk about the next topic of classification. So what is reproductive isolation? Well, when the two species can't produce fertile offspring together. So what's preventing them from doing this? Well, there are two main types of isolating mechanisms, reproductive isolating mechanisms. First is prezygotic, in which you prevent the formation of zygotes. There is no fertilized egg. If there's no fertilized egg, you don't have kids. Right? Then there's post-zygotic isolating mechanisms. Happens after the zygote is formed. That means somehow the offspring will not be fertile, so that they cannot produce other offspring. We're going to focus first our attention on isolating mechanisms. Now, I listed them, and I'm going to talk about them. So please pay attention and get this information down if you need to review what I've said. So habitat differences. Well, this makes sense. If the different species don't live in the same habitat, they cannot mate and have offspring. Okay, that makes sense. So if you don't live in the same place, you can't have, you are different species. Now, this is naturally populations. Okay? So what happens if you do live in the same habitat, but you have differences in breeding times? Well, if you have differences in breeding times, the individuals will not mate, and they will not, since they do not mate, they will not have fertile offspring. Okay, let's say they live in the same place and they have the same breeding times. Well, there are some behavioral differences. Remember, the males must attract the females, and they do different things. They might build a house. They might give gifts. They might do a certain dance or have a certain call, right? All those things are important so that the female will be able to choose the correct male, the one with the biggest house, the best dance, the best call. So behavioral difference. Now in predators, this is really important because a lot of times the male will look like a dinner for the female, unless of course it does the right thing. And if it does, then maybe the male will have a chance to mate. So let's say they live in the same place. They have the same breeding times. They have the correct behavior for mating, but then they have mechanical differences. Now, I can't put it any more delicately than if the male doesn't have the right key to fit into the female's right lock. And you might be asking yourself, well, how many keys and locks are there? Each species has their own different keys to fit in the different types of locks. I mean, we could talk about this in class, but every species has their own shape, and shape is everything. So let's say the habitat, they live in the same habitat, they have the same breeding times, the behavior is fine, the key fits into the lock. Well, then you have gametic differences when the sperm don't have the right receptors for the eggs, or the sperm don't have the right enzymes to digest its way through the egg, or the sperm can't find its way to the egg. If all those things don't happen, you will not produce a zygote and you will not have a child. You're different species. What happened post-zygotic? So let's say you've done everything right. You live in the same area. You have the same breeding times. You have the correct behavior. The key fits in the lock. The gametes are okay. And the zygote is formed. So now you have a fertilized egg. Well, sometimes that zygote does not survive. And if it does not survive, then you will not have a child, and that child will not be fertile. Sometimes you do have a child, but the offspring is infertile because the chromosomes don't pair up during meiosis. And if they have a different chromosome number, that will happen. So if the chromosomes don't line up in meiosis, then guess what? You are sterile. Now, sometimes the female or the individual is fertile, but the male is always sterile. So if the male is sterile, you cannot have kids if your female is fertile. Now, this can explain introgression, where the genes of one species is introduced into another species. So let's say a horse and a donkey mate, they have a mule, and let's say that the female mule is fertile. Now, the female mule can mate with a horse or a donkey and have kids that are primarily horses or donkeys. When that happens, you introduce the genes of the other species into the new population. Now, I put on the bottom humans and Neanderthals. So humans and Neanderthals must have had children. The females must have been uh, fertile. They must have mated with the humans. And when they mated with the humans, or the human individuals, then they have introduced the Neanderthal genes into the human or human individual population. So we are going to stop there because we need to talk about St. Patrick's speciation, but I don't think I'll have enough time. So if you have any questions, please feel free to watch the video over again. It's nice and short. Read the textbook or ask me tomorrow in class. Have a good night.